Hello. Let's see. Hi, everyone. So welcome to another discussion with the Dream Collective. And today we're going to be discussing sports and athletics and how do institutions best serve student athletes. So in particular, the focus will be on health and safety, race, and revenue. So the people who I've invited today to the table are but a handful of scholars and experts who are activists, who I consider to be activists in sports. I want to introduce you to those folks. So Eddie Cole is a professor, associate professor, higher education at UCLA. He is a professor in the Pac-12, and typically I don't associate anyone other than an athlete at an institution with those particular titles. I think it's offensive. I mean, if you're not playing, then quit claiming you're a part of like Power Five. But I'm going to go ahead and do that for a reason today. He is the author of Campus Colorline, College Presidents in the Struggle for Black Freedom. He's won numerous awards that we will not get into, but what I do want to get into is his recent Washington Post op-ed that was absolutely brilliant. So if you want to Google it really quickly, it's called, just Google his name and Washington Post, Playing Football in 2020. Will it continue to devalue Black lives? The next person on the panel is James Satterfield. He's a professor of higher education and department head at Auburn University. So he is situated with athletes in the SEC, right?
Right.
Most importantly, he is a former linebacker for Norfolk State. I think that's important. That brings a different perspective. Tamika Ferguson is interim assistant dean of student affairs and inclusive excellence. Do I have that correct? Okay, because I will make up a title. Assistant professor of ed leadership, founder of Black Athletes Sister Circle, former track star at UVA, has a wonderful paper that she co-wrote with James Satterfield that talks about hyperfemininity. Google hyperfemininity, Tamika Ferguson. Earl Smith is an American sociologist, currently the Rubin Distinguished Professor Emeritus of American Ethnic Studies at Wake Forest University, and also was a distinguished professor at Colgate, and currently teaches, is that correct, at James Madison?
No, University
Okay.
of Delaware. University of Delaware.
University of Delaware, great. Wonderful book that I continue to reference, Race, Sport, and American Dream. And a recent paper that I picked up from 2018, Policing Black Bodies. So these are four of the scholars that do this work, but let me point to some other folks. And the reason why I think this is important is because, I'll just warn you in advance, I will never understand why leagues, professional or non-professional, which are really professional too, collegiate athletes, folks who have no area of expertise, nothing that has to do with sports and race, but they'll ask someone in to come and speak with not only universities, but in particular, professional sports or professional athletes about race because they present as a particular race and in particular, African American. And so these four folks have expertise and race and athletics. So these are the folks that should be at the table, not a random person who used to play or random person who presents as someone who looks to be African American. I also have a list of people, and I hope this doesn't come off as a shout out. And if it does, so what? But these are people that I just wanted to mention very quickly, and I know that I'm going to miss people. And if I do, send us something, because I'd like to post this to a website so that those professional leagues will actually call somebody who knows what they're talking about. They will actually call folks to sit at the table who can have a good discussion with them and reach some sort of solution. So Eddie Como, he's somewhere in California. C. Keith Harrison, he's at Central Florida. Todd Boyd, he can be anywhere you want him to be. He's at USC. Shropshire just left in the last couple of years. Penn, he's at Arizona State. There is someone at USC, and I cannot remember his name. I know he's from the UK, and he left Texas, and he's now at USC. Frank Harris is at Texas. Is it Frank Harris or Harrison?
Harris.
He's at Texas. Jamel Donner, he's at William and Mary. Sean Harper is at USC. Mary Howard Hamilton and Candace Hinton are at Indiana State. Joy Gaston Gale is at North Carolina State. Somebody just entered my mind and I can't remember who it is, but there are dozens of folks who do this work, and there's a ton of work that needs to be done. And these are the people who should be called. So I want to just go ahead and open up with some questions. And so we'll talk probably for about an hour, and then we'll open it up to other folks to just ask some questions. So the first question is, what should institutions of higher education be doing to support student athletes during a health pandemic? And so I want to direct this right now to Eddie.
Sure. First off, hello everyone watching live, as well as everyone who's watching this in the future on the recording. I'm happy to be here with these distinguished thinkers on this topic. Just to answer the question, my comments today will be most centered from a historical perspective, because as a scholar of higher education history, someone who studies college presence and race, I think it's absolutely critical to understand how the past shapes this current moment. So when I think about what institutions should be doing, present day in the contemporary context is absolutely critical for university leaders, specifically college presidents, to make these decisions within the context of the broader society, right? We understand the racial uprisings happening throughout the nation, throughout the world this summer. And so any decision as it pertains to supporting student athletes, particularly in the global pandemic, it's going to be critical to understand what it means to put students first, their health and well-being first. And I'll give you an example historically for that. In my book, on The Campus Color Line, I talk about UCLA, which is where I currently work. But also I talk about Chancellor Franklin Murphy and John Wooden, a coach who we're all familiar with. And UCLA basketball in December 1961 actually travels to Houston for a 2-game tournament. They have some Black players on the UCLA basketball team, but in Houston, think about the Jim Crow South, there's segregation everywhere involved with this particular basketball tournament, from segregation in the stands to universities down south being segregated, so forth. And the racial epithets, the racism directed toward the Black players at UCLA is so brutal in the first game that the Black UCLA players, John Wooden, decides not to play them in the second game in Houston, right? This completely turns the UCLA campus up in an uproar. As you can imagine, that why are we even playing against universities in locations that would subject students to this particular sort of treatment. And you can imagine sort of the parallels to think about the well-being of students, particularly Black student athletes. And so what happens is within 2 months, the University of California system, every campus from Clark Kerr, the president of the university system, to Franklin Murphy, the chancellor at UCLA, the university system passes a new policy that is the first in the university history, to where university presidents think in the broader context of the freedom rides, what's going on with civil rights movement, student unrest throughout the nation, and they pass a policy that says UC campuses, teams would no longer play against universities that uphold segregation, be it through hotel facilities, the audience, segregated rosters, and so forth. When you step back from your particular institution, your particular university, and look within the broader social context, that's how institutions should be able to look historically at examples where college presidents, chancellors have put student well-being first and passed policy changes, which is evident of the demands that students are making right now, policy changes that put students' health and well-being first. That by far, stepping away from these insular decision-making and stepping back and looking from a broader context. Throughout history, we see that those are some of the best examples of how college athletes have been supported by university administrators in a model that we can apply to today.
Appreciate that.
It's unfortunate, and Dr. Cole, thank you for that brief history. It's unfortunate that nobody paid attention. I mean, you know, what was the year again?
1961.
Okay, so here we are, 2020, 2018. Everybody sitting on this panel knows the history of student athletes, Black student athletes, women who are student athletes, and college chancellors, presidents, coaches. They must have all put in earplugs when this was happening in 1961, because there's a terrible history of the institutions, the coaches, the sports, putting those things first way before the student athletes. And I'll just point to an institution I spent some time at, about 15 years, Washington State University. They got some crap going on there right now, 2020, that's related to health and safety, but it's also related to dollars. And you have coaches, you know, dismissing student athletes, students, from their team simply because the young, in this case, young men are saying, we have some health issues, and we all talk about these laws that don't allow us to look into a student's health, you know, whether they have this, that, or the other. But this young man put his business right out there, and he told the coach, this is what's happening to me health-wise. And basically, if I'm up to date with this, he either has been dismissed from the team, some of his teammates have been, or he will be. So I like the story, Dr. Cole, and it's beautiful. But boy, there's some people who are supposed to be intellectuals, who are supposed to be, you know, quote, father figures to the team, all that stuff they talk about, teachers, but they sure haven't paid attention across all those years. And I'll stop there.
I'm glad you brought that up. In your study of college presidents, and from what we know about college presidents, the buck kind of stops with them and the board of trustees. They can override anything, and they can override discourse and discussions that coaches are having with college students Why do you think that's not, it doesn't seem like it's happening? Why do you think it seems like there's a silence? I would have thought Monday morning, there would have been something in the Post, in the Times, something, and just not that much. I was like, where's the statement? I mean, there's not much that's been, they could stop that, the student from being, the 3 or 4 students from being kicked off the team. I mean, that's the rumor. And typically those rumors are pretty clear. I've gone to folks, parents' websites, and Twitter accounts to try and fact check. So what's happening? And where's the FAR? Where's the wonderful faculty athletic reps during these conversations? And I say that because I was one, and I was a very loud one. So where are they?
Well, unfortunately, everyone doesn't have your perspective on that particular position. And I have found that a lot of them have been co-opted into the organization and don't seek to actually represent the student or the athlete for that matter. They simply seek to represent the organization. So it is not about the protection of the athlete or the student. It is simply about propagating the particular ideology. I think, but if I could digress for a moment, I think what we're actually experiencing or unpacking right now during this pandemic associated with university athletics is we are now discovering in a very large scale how poorly they have been managed financially. To worry to have to put a child, I'm going to call, because I'm old, I have reached the point where I can start calling some of these young men and women children, because they are still, if we look at brain development, they have not fully developed. But we are willing to put them in harm's way for financial gain. And that is unfortunate. And that's the perspective that I am, that worries me is, how fundamentally just poorly managed financially that we have allowed these institutions to get, and just allowing the use of student athlete labor to promote the economic health and well-being of an institution. That is woefully, it's disheartening. It's very, very disheartening.
James, I like your point, because what it further discusses is that it's not just the institution that has been poorly managed. Think about the athletic funding and the principals. We've had so much research and so many discussions about revenue generating sports and how they're important, and how literally the entire industry, what it is, college sports is an industry. The entire industry of college sports rides on the backs of majority Black players and these 3 or 4 sports at some institutions that become profitable. And one of the things we have to think about is who is setting these policies and who is upholding the policies. And so I think about policies when I think about this, because the policies that are being led and being used and implemented by a lot of the administrators, even those who have done a great job of diversifying their administrators, were not created by those administrators. They were created to protect the athletic department. They were created to protect the interests of the athletic department, and they were created to protect the legacy and the longevity of it. So what we're also running into is a sustainability issue. Sustainability means that we can coexist and we can continue to run and we can weather the storm of crisis management. I feel as though athletics is functioning a triage because no one ever forethought that we would be here. And it's not to say that we haven't had great administrators who've done good work, right? However, where's the foresight? Where is the planning for a rainy day? And this is more than a rainy day, but people are responding in such a, we've never seen this before, a panic that some of the things are losing sight of the athletes. So if we look at some of the decisions around how we're going to continue this sport, are you trying to continue the sport for the athlete to participate or for the revenue to come back for you to run the athletic department? And people are losing their jobs. And that's one of the things when you say, how can we support athletes? The original question is we have to remember them in the decisions that are being made. And a lot of the decisions that are being made are really, what is the bottom line? How can we keep staff hired, and keep salaries going? How can we not quit sports? I understand that that is a huge part of this conversation. But if that also means that we are forgetting that the student athlete needs to be healthy and safe, and we are thinking about the ways in which we are protecting them, like mental health. And one of the things I want to posit here is that we're talking about like this shift that's happening with sport and the way people are reacting to it. Sport has always been a rallying cry, right? This unifying social movement and this unifying community building initiative and activity. And now it's becoming a site of potential trauma for athletes, for coaches, for staff. You have athletes that love the game that are now saying, if I don't go, I won't get my degree. If I don't go back to campus, if I don't compete, what will I lose in this? And so we have to also think about the mental health and potential mental health crisis that will happen as a result of everything that's happening in this pandemic, and how we are responding as administrators and faculty and people who are at the table who have these platforms. Where are the athletes' voices in what we're saying? And without them saying their specific claims, then we are going to keep getting demands, and then they have to rely on individuals to pick through the demands that they feel are of their interest as well. And then we come into the convergence problem, and then we're back to it. Is it enough? What is enough? What is sufficient in responding to the needs of the student athletes?
So Tamika, you're speaking about the subtext is about who should be sitting at that table. And I think we sort of know who should be sitting at that table, but can you guys talk about it a little bit more in depth? And how do we get the right folks at the table? How does that happen? Because student athletes typically are not at the table. We know that they have SAC meetings, and I also think that they have very powerful voices. But there's no response. We see right now, there's no response when they do show any evidence of activism. And I'm like, well, why aren't there even faculty saying something? We know that college presidents are likely not going to say anything because, quite frankly, they're allowing this to happen in Pac-12. But who should be at the table? Whose voices should be heard?
Well, okay, let me say this, but I can tell you who shouldn't be at the table that I hear. So I'm new to Auburn, right? I think I've been here 65 days, right? 65 days. So I've moved my entire family during a pandemic, and we're making friends or trying to make friends in the neighborhood. But I can tell you, having been previously at Clemson, I'm very familiar with the kind of attitude that surrounds and engulfs people who believe themselves to be associated with the university and the football program. So that kind of garners a particular attitude of ownership, right? When I hear people talk about, are we going to do this? Are we going to play this year? Or, when we beat Alabama, and it's just like, wow. And I can tell you, just as an outsider looking in, the attitude is, I buy season tickets, I attend the game, I buy food economically in the community to do my tailgating, and we hire people to do all these things. So it's very much an economic engine. So when and it establishes tradition for the people who are doing this thing. So they very much feel like we are taking something from them that is theirs, that they own, and that they have a right to do. I don't think, let me be clear, I don't think any of those people should be factored into the equation at all. You know, you have a right to buy season tickets. Well, you should have the right to take your season tickets away if you're willing to put our children in harm's way. So I don't think any of those people should be at the table. I think we should have folks at the table like the student athlete. We should have folks at the table who are what I would consider to be hardcore academicians who may not necessarily want to be a part of the athletic culture, who are just traditional academics, but have a human-centered perspective in how we need to proceed. So that's just what I think thus far.
I agree with you, but also college presidents are definitely going to have those people at the table. Because I mean, just throughout history and present day, right? I mean, who are your most prominent donors? Your season ticket holders who writes the big check. Just in the last 2 days, seeing the Pac-12 student demands, I went back to the 2014 when the boosters at the University of Alabama paid off Nick Saban's house in Tuscaloosa. I mean, does Nick Saban need anyone to pay off his house? Not at all. But nonetheless, those people definitely will have a voice to college presidents. But to my other point, here's to the original question that Dr. Hughes asked regarding why college presidents are so silent and where does the buck really stop? Is it with them or is it with the board? There's this broader question that's warranted, hands down, around college presidents between where they stand personally on issues and where they stand within the position professionally. And you see throughout history, there's a tension there. Ideally, who we are in our work every day is who we are personally, and we can lead with that. But oftentimes, for whatever reason, the college presidency has been so politicized, it's been so outwardly facing that it seems like very few things are genuine in what comes out of that position, even if the person in it, deep within their heart, wants to do something otherwise. So trustees do have a big say, but it's one of those things where you see this tension among those college presidents who have academic backgrounds right now in public health, or who are medical doctors. It is one of the most fascinating sub-stories in media right now that isn't getting nearly enough attention. When you see someone who has studied this from a scientific standpoint, who has excelled through being the dean of a medical school and now the university chancellor or university president, and seeing their tension as they skirt the trustee pressure and public pressure and revenue pressure, which we've all talked about, alongside what they know is a public health crisis from a scientific standpoint. So they get into this position, and yeah, I mean, who should be at the table? You should have some scientists like themselves at the table, but can they take off the presidential hat and join the pure academic enterprise and have that conversation? It remains to be seen. And history tells us it's rare, it happens, but not so much.
Probably not.
So as you think about like what's happening, and specifically students being pushed out of school and no one saying anything, like it's just fine. I think of like grassroots efforts, just like the students in the Pac-12. And my assumption is that the other four, hopefully, are at least having a conversation. I'm also hopeful that faculty will start some sort of grassroots discussion. I think that there are enough of us who have a concern about truly all students. We've had discussions on our campus and other campuses where they have put together these tremendous forces that are trying to assure that all students are safe. But I'm not sure in any of those discussions whether athletes are being considered. I'm pretty sure that they're not, given the practices, et cetera, and push for folks to get on the court and field. But as students are being pushed out, what are your thoughts about like HBCUs and the implications this may have for Black colleges and universities?
Well, as a graduate, a two-time degree graduate of an HBCU and a former HBCU college athlete, this is woefully unpopular amongst my colleagues. Some of them should not be playing anyway, from a purely financial perspective. I think it was, I can't remember the president's name, but he was at Paul Quinn College in Texas, and he pulled it and told them, you know, if you all want to play, I know homecoming is important. If you all want to play, we're gonna have to have $1 million. And he turned the football field into a farm, essentially. You know, and that's huge. I don't remember off the top of my head if they ever got back to playing football, but that's, you know, that's brave. I see Eddie shaking his head no, but, and that's brave. And, you know, the reality of it is, they probably shouldn't have been playing anyway. But I think what this does for HBCUs is forces HBCU presidents to reevaluate, you know, the athletic programs in general. If you look at what's happening right now in the MEAC, just about all of the, not want to say all, but a lot of the universities have left the MEAC and gone to the SWAC. You look at what Hampton University has done by leaving the you know, originally the CIAA, then to the MEAC, and in a very short time has now joined the Big South. So, you know, make no mistake about it. This is financially driven. This is recruitment driven. I think some of the, you know, I don't know, quite frankly, I don't know where some of these institutions are getting the money to join some of these athletic programs, but I just think it gives us an opportunity to hit pause for a little bit, just to think about what this might mean for HBCU athletics that's dying anyway, unfortunately.
Appreciate it. Eddie, did you want to add something?
No, yeah, I'll just say, you know, regarding HBCU athletics, I've spent a lot of time following the HBCU presidents in this particular moment. And spot on, you know, I've been saying this entire time, regardless of the motivation, HBCU administrators seem to be leading the way, if you will, as far as the safest decisions, public health oriented decisions, and just being frank about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Black community. And this, you know, and what it means to their students, and students when they come to campus and go back home. So what it means to students' families, faculty, staff, and the administrators themselves. I'm sure, you know, they've certainly got all of that in mind. But to the broader point around HBCU athletics as well, Hampton being in the Mid-South right now, that is really notable in the sense that they have still opted out of fall sports. In the Mid-South, has obviously said, we understand, do what you got to do. But the Mid-South, as of right now, I think, if I'm understanding correctly, still plans to proceed, even with the, smaller conference only schedule. But Hampton's decision, even not being in the MEAC right now, is still this very internal focus on the well-being of students, not just student athletes, but the entire student body. I think that's impressive. And, we're not, giving it, I mean, that's a worthy conversation to be had.
If I can return to a comment about the chancellors and presidents for a moment. The Knight Commission, in one of their surveys of college presidents, was asking some very difficult questions about finances and how these athletic programs were financed, and how at some universities the athletic budget was removed from the larger university budget, and all that kind of stuff that they did with athletic financing. So they went and they asked these presidents, who were supposed to be, quote, the leaders of the institutions, and they asked them some very tough questions. And here's what they did. They would only answer the questions anonymously. You hear me? These are the people who are supposed to be the leadership. They would only answer the difficult questions anonymously. So, when I hear about who's in charge, remember, some of these football coaches and basketball coaches make much more money. Dr. Cole mentioned Nick Saban, for one. And in the world we live in, you don't take a back seat to somebody who makes less money than you in that business world. And so these coaches, they could care less about who's the president, who's the chancellor, other than when they're doing a photo op, because they're in charge of their program. Now, as someone mentioned recently, because of these tough economic times, it seems like these athletic administrators, ADs, et cetera, they're crawling back over to the university, saying how much they're struggling financially. But when you look at these various charts about how much money athletics take in, how much money they spend, they take in $1, they spend $1.05. And so all of a sudden they don't have any money. What I'm afraid of, since our discussion here is focused on the student athlete, what I'm afraid of is what they're going to do with these
I think we're losing you.
how
Can you all hear Dr. Smith? Dr. Smith, I think we're losing you in the storm. Can you hear us?
So I hate that we lost Dr. Smith because of the hurricane, but I thought that he was shifting the conversation in a really good direction. One of the things that he was starting to talk about was just how are we really managing these finances? How are we making sure that we are stable? And one of the things that in focusing on the student and the HBCU perspective, oh, he's back. Keep going, Dr. Smith.
I just wanted to say, and I'm sorry again, that we need to pay attention to what's happening with these young men and women who are on scholarship. who are exercising their rights to opt out of sport at a very dangerous time, and how these institutions are going to treat them, which I think will say a lot about the values and the norms of these institutions.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the things, and what I was shifting to was how are we funding athletics with a way that we're thinking about the student athlete in mind. And I've talked to a lot of college administrators over the past few months, and you remember in the spring when sports were cut out, when spring sports were cut, you had athletes who wanted to come back and compete again for a fifth year if they were going to graduate. Or the school still upholding that? Because that was an individual decision. Not all colleges said that they could fund it and afford it. But what about those student athletes who are coming back? What is their experience going to be? And will they actually be able to compete? If they don't compete, will the institution still maintain their support? We know that some schools will support the student athletes. If we cut your, you know, the thing is, if we cut your sport, we'll keep your scholarship, we'll still fund you. So we know that that's happening. However, what is the treatment is a great question that Dr. Smith brought up. Will they still be a part of the team, or will they just matriculate into the regular student body? If they do take this year off, does that mean that next year they're going to have a conversation in spring where they need to transfer? Are they going to have a spot? Will they have to compete for it? What is going to be that experience? But when I started thinking about finances again, and this was brought up, Dr. Satterfield and Dr. Cole were talking about funding of HBCUs. If we think about just how athletics is not financially prosperous for a lot of places, there are always a lot of people operating not in the black, but in the red. And so for some institutions who are choosing not to compete, I wonder if they're thinking, this is an opportunity for us to balance our budget. We might need to cut away the extra fat that we don't need. And in that cutting of fat, are they focusing on the student athlete experience, or are they focusing on shifting the pressure to the donors? Hey, donors, we need more money. We want to beef this up. When we come back, this is what we want. Because not everyone is a Stanford or Harvard or all these places that have endowed football teams and coaching positions. Those are like, that's a real indication that your school is going to be okay, even in the midst of a pandemic. But when sports are being cut, coaches are losing jobs, student athletes aren't competing, where are they going to go in a pandemic? You know, where are they going to transfer to? And how are we protecting those student athletes who, because of, you know, poor finances and a lack of actually thinking about balancing a budget, that they now are the first ones that are cut off, and they are quote unquote considered the low hanging fruit. Now, there are some institutions that will argue and say, no, we've been looking at this sport for years. It hasn't been a good financial decision. We had planned on cutting them anyways. Perhaps, but the timing makes me question, why are you cutting the sport now? You know, why didn't you cut it in the previous few years? And so we have to think about, like, how are we going to manage our finances? Because the way we manage our finances directly impacts the student athlete experience. So I come from track and field, and I was a walk-on who earned a full. So there are a lot of athletes who are not on full scholarships. They're on partial. And so if they are already experiencing hardship at home, if they are already coming from communities, our Black athletes, our Latinx athletes, where they're coming and they are already disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, and now you're in a sport that might be cut, where are they at? Where are we thinking about those athletes that are facing so many intersectional issues that it makes it really difficult for those who are higher up and the senior administrators to think about these individuals, because they have to think about the bottom line, or they have to think about the reputation of the institution. And so it really does make me think that there's so many layers to this that it's hard to say, is it a institution specific problem? Is it a student athlete and protecting their experience problem? You know, where does it lie? But who's at the table should be representative of all of those different intersected identities, all of those different stakeholders that are at the table. If you say you want an athlete to compete, but you haven't asked that athlete if they want to compete, that's one example that you are missing someone at the table. And just because a coach wants to compete doesn't mean that they're going to have a team that's willing and able to do it. So I have a daughter who has chronic asthma. And what if you have chronic asthma and you're immunocompromised? Do you really want to say, hey, you either compete or lose your scholarship, or you compete and lose your starting spot that you might have worked really, really hard for 2 years. There are problems that we have to really think about and consider as equal footing to balancing the budget, and also the student athlete experience overall, and how we are protecting their experience. So that I just come back to the word trauma, because the student athletes I've engaged in are having a really difficult time of thinking and conceptualizing what their experience is about to be like in this 2020-21 academic year. They aren't thinking about a budget. They're thinking about, can I just go to practice? I don't really care. I mean, I'm young. If I get COVID, it's not going to be that bad, right? So we have to think about making sure that they are well informed when they are at the table, and that they are thinking about themselves and not just their labor, because sometimes that happens. They've been seen as labor for so much that they start to only think about their productivity, even if they're called upon to even speak and share their voice.
So Tamika, you sort of are getting at like this new normal, and I can't stand, I always tell people, I preface it with that, I can't stand that new normal, because the assumption is that there was something normal about things that were abnormal and not good for anybody at all. But it sort of sounds like you're getting to like a neo new normal. So as we think about like this new way of thinking, which should have been thought about hundreds of years ago, what sort of opportunities do you think institutions have to affect change? And specifically, I'm thinking about some of the demands that the students had in their document. And I think, quite frankly, some of them were well thought out, especially for undergraduate students who tend not to know all of the, and none of us do, all of the underpinnings of how institutions of higher education work. So one of the things that they noted, and they have like an asterisk by it, they talk about like other ways to fund things. And in an asterisk, they mention the $27.7 billion endowment at Stanford. And all of us don't know how endowments work, but they can't. Is that me? And I don't know
via the phone call.
Sorry about that. So I was saying, we don't know how, all of us don't know exactly how endowments work, because the typical response is, oh, we can't use that money for X, Y, Z. Yeah, you can. Sometimes you can. Folks use money for what they consider to be important. So what are some of the things that institutions could do given this opportunity for new normality, and to be more creative and to respond directly to the needs of these students? None of this stuff scares me. If I were a president, first of all, I wouldn't have gotten this far. And I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to diss anybody, but maybe I am. But I would have been in conversation with folks before they dragged me all over Twitter and the media, et cetera. So what are some of the things that you could tell like a president or an administrator or somebody? These are some of the things you can do right now. The first thing I would say is call up the leader and tell him to bring his crew and come to my office, and let's sit down and chat, because it won't go away, even with the threats. And quite frankly, that is what they are, the threats from those coaches at some institutions.
You know, I think,
Things.
you know, one of the things that I really think about is this is actually, I'm a glasses half full person. You know, thank you, student athletes, one, for being informed. You know, we always say that we want to value the student athlete voice, and then when they start speaking, we realize how intelligent and advanced they are. We have to appreciate it. So the first thing we should say is thank you for doing the work for us, okay? Because at times, if we don't say that, we lose the fact that they actually have made our job easier. If I was a president, like you said, Robin, and I got this, I now know where to start versus creating a year-wide task force of all these people to sit down and give me a list that the student athletes have already done. So one is appreciating the student athlete and letting them know that they are valuable and their voice is not only heard, but that it will be taken into consideration and that their voice should be at the table for whatever moves forward. So I would use this as an opportunity to engage these athletes. First of all, who was a part of it? And two, where did you get this knowledge? Because, you know, that's letting them know that perhaps our athletic directors might not be as privy as the student athletes are. So I would go first to the person who runs the athletic department. Do our athletic directors actually know what's happening with their student athletes? Now, we know that they're not in the day-to-day because of the pure organizational chart. But if this is happening, there's a miscommunication or lack of knowledge happening. Athletic directors run everything. They know who they hire. They hire people to lead their vision. They hire people to buy into how they run and how they manage. And so because of that power and authority, we have to start with the athletic director and whether they are even on board with some of this. You become an athletic director because of your skill and acumen, and also if you're a great fundraiser. And so that means that they know how to get a message out and share the narrative of the athletic department. And so if we don't start with them, we can't necessarily have an idea of what is being talked about in those conversations for the donor stakeholders, right? That are gonna fund, which sometimes push initiatives that athletic directors will then give to their team to lead. And so I would start with that, of knowing where we actually are. And then we have to hold athletic directors accountable. Do you understand the racial and ethnic experience of your student athletes on your campus? Do you understand the gendered experience? Do you understand these things? A lot of trainings that have been going on that, you know, webinars and things like that, how many have athletic directors watched? How are they retooling themselves and learning about the experiences of their students of color? And I think that just as though we will hold someone accountable for, you know, faculty are held accountable for having diversified syllabi and decolonized syllabi in this movement. Faculty and staff are being asked, join a task force. How are we supporting Black students and brown students? We need to say, athletic directors, what are you doing to change your hiring practices? How are you coming to the table and having a plan to respond to these needs? Because what we're seeing is we're seeing student athletes who have been not heard for so long that they're using the platforms that they have access to get their voice out without permission. They no longer need permission of an administrator to get their voice out, meaning that administrators have to catch up and quickly catch up to where the athletes are and what they have in mind and what they need. And so I think that's where we start. You know, you have to maybe re-engage your athletes and then do a review of your policies. Because what I'm seeing is they're now aware of the lack of value, but the value that they have, right? The lack of value that they receive, but the value that they have, the value add that they have. And because of that knowledge, we need to make sure that we have policies and procedures that acknowledge that we too are aware and that we're working to eradicate inequity, not just equality, but inequity when it comes to financing. I think about support of different sports. Are sports being funded equitably? It's not just a Title IX issue, but it's a policy issue. And when those policies and procedures are set up by institutions, who at the table? And so now with the right people at the table, like we just talked about, revisit these and update them with an equitable mindset. And it still goes back to making sure that our athletic directors understand that they are held accountable for what happens below them and the experiences of those who are working under their vision and their leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Ferguson, that no doubt, absolutely. The one thing I just want to echo and stress this point that you just made to college presidents, student activists make it so clear for administrators what needs to be done. I can't stress the point that you just made enough that we don't need another year of a task force or another committee. The action items are right there before you. Student activists have been exceedingly generous throughout history, even though they get a reputation for being rabble rousers and, you know, stirring up the pot. But in reality, students have been making set demands and hinting at these topics for years, as history shows us. I mean, this 2020 is a particular moment, and we're talking about it right now, but you can just go back decade after decade, academic generation before academic generation, and these issues have been on the table. It's just a matter of we are certainly listening now. They certainly have different avenues of getting their message out, but the demands are clear, the demands are old, and the action items are right there because students have done the lead work, they've done the reading, they've made the connections between the global pandemic and racism and inequity in funding. They see this, the line is so clear between all these issues. Administrators at this point are left to act.
Look, thank you, had a faculty member call the student the N-word, that person would not be working at the institution much longer than that. I don't think so. At Clemson, that has blown up. I mean, I drove around that campus last summer and I couldn't believe the expanse that has taken place with that big shiny thing that looks like the college football championship trophy sitting on top of the building. But student athletes have said that they had coaches in the locker room, the sacred locker room, all Black athletes the N-word. Dabo Swinney, who's the coach who's in charge, basically ignored it.
Yeah, he's gone. I will tell you, you can Google on the Chronicle of Higher Ed, you know, it is little known, but publicized or well publicized. Dabo Swinney
And didn't
baptized.
believe this to bring back some former stars onto the pros. I hope you can hear me.
We can now.
Say that again?
We can now. We lost you for a moment, but we can hear you now.
No, I'm done. I just wanted to bring that up to point out that these things happen, as Dr. Cole was saying, this has been going on for decade after decade after decade, but in 2020, the spotlight is on it. You have a coach who's done that and there's no consequences, at least that I know about. And the athletes weren't believed until they brought back some former superstars who are going to have this private conversation with the coach. I mean, all of this stuff is just unbelievable. So I'm wondering, well, why don't 15 of Clemson's starters decide they're not going to play? That would end it right there. They're not going to play. But they hold the punishment issue over the student athlete's head. You talk back, you bring these grievances to the table, and you're done for, unless you can run the 100-yard dash in 9 flat. You're done for. And so these athletes know that by participating on these college campuses and whatever sport they're in, this is basically their future. And the future is fraught with all kinds of roadblocks. You sign this athlete up, they go to the combine, and the coach says, difficult, hard to get along with. You're done. And I've seen this across 30 years of working at these institutions that have sport factories. So I feel bad for these young men and women, but there needs to be a further push from what these Pac-12 athletes have done. I mean, they've put it on the table again, and now it's time to seize the time to make sure that these rich institutions that make their money off the backs of Black people. Robin mentioned our text on policing the Black body. We talk about this in this text. that this is a continuation of the slave mode of production, a flat out continuation. And who can say that these young people shouldn't go out on the field or not? I mean, they have to make that kind of decision, but systematically, these institutions have been doing a number. I mean, for all of us who are obviously faculty, count the number of times that you get the knock on your door and a student wants to come in and shut the door and tell you in private, because they trust you, what's going on. And they can't tell anybody else. It's unbelievable. And I'm sure every one of us have had that experience. Thank you.
You know, I will tell you all a quick story. You know, during my last year at Clemson, in their, you know, the run up towards their national championship, and Deshaun Watson had made a tweet about something, and I tweeted, you know, right back, and it was along the lines of, you know, sometimes, you know, sometimes even the victim will believe that his oppressor is, you know, his favorite person, so to speak. It was along those lines. I received an email, not a tweet, an email from a former African-American graduate and Board of Trustee member from Clemson, chastising me and telling me that I should not have written that tweet. I should be more conscious of where I am situated within the institution, and my tweet was inappropriate, and he wanted to meet with me. I declined the meeting. I told him, and I sent him some of the latest work that I had been working on with respects to that, and said that I would not be willing to meet with him, but I would, you know, allow him to read some of the academic work in this area. But you know, the interesting thing with that was, you know, I had said when you, Dr. Smith, when you had, we had lost you for a second, I was saying at Clemson, a lot of folks don't know. So like they provide this element of family, right? They are masters at making everyone believe that it's, you know, all in and all for one, and we're one big family. So if a student athlete claims not to be, you know, saved, Dabo Swinney and other coaches and other players will baptize a student out on the field in a whirlpool. It's documented in the Chronicle of Higher Education. They will baptize a young man out on the field in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or whatever, or maybe Vince Lombardi, who knows, right? But this happens. This happens to this day.
I have a couple of questions that I wanted you guys to address from folks that are online. And someone asked, what can faculty do to better support student athletes, particularly during the pandemic? And then also, what might sports look like post-pandemic, if that even exists? That isn't their exact words, but.
So I enjoy the question about what can faculty do, because I do believe that is a disconnect that happens. You know, as faculty members, well, I can speak for myself. As a faculty member, I work with our athletic department. I run a program for Black athletes, Black women athletes. I go to the games. I'm a fan. I think one thing is, if you feel safe and there is competition, you know, going in to support student athletes and they're competing. That seems really small. But, you know, there's going to be a lack of trust socially, like outside of the institution in our country, about should we gather, should we not gather? So if there's an opportunity to safely support our student athletes when things do get started, I think that is one of the easiest ways that we can show up for them. And also, if you don't know who the student athletes are that are in your department, even if they are not in your classes, making sure that your chair and your colleagues are aware that, hey, you know, I'm standing with our athletes. I am here if they want to debrief something, if they don't know that they can have a closed door conversation with me, I'm here for them, making sure that they feel as though that they can go to someone. Because a lot of times their classes are going to be virtual for the most part in the fall for a lot of our institutions. So they're not going to be able to walk across campus or walk upstairs if they have class downstairs. So how do we make ourselves as faculty more accessible to our student athletes in a way that might just be a conversation? There might be nothing that we can do for them. Maybe they are just stressed out and they don't feel comfortable going to seek out mental health opportunities to deal with like some of the stress, because this is a new stressor that's happening and they might not know or be aware of it yet. Because I was talking with a colleague this morning who's a senior athletic administrator, and we were chatting. I said, what happens if we do go back and the pandemic spreads and then we have another spring situation? What is that type of disruption going to do to our student athletes? And that is what I'm worried about as a faculty member and as a supporter of college athletics. I'm worried about that potential happening. Well, we now have to deal with clearing campus all over again. We now have to deal with, you know, student athletes having seasons disrupted and ended, and them, especially our football players who came back in June or July thinking they were going to compete. There's some who had to be sent home. There's some who might have to be sent home if that happens. How do we handle that and their expectations for their longevity in their careers or whatever, you know, their the products of their work? But I do think that we have to first be accessible. Second, let our people around us who have access to our student athletes know that we are accessible, that we are a partner, and that we are willing to have those conversations within our, you know, our circle of comfort. But I think that that's an easy way to start that doesn't involve a policy or procedure or approval, because we are people on campus and we are resources for our student athletes.
Thank you. One of the other things that needs to happen in these discussions of change, for example, the NCAA is meeting today to talk about some things. My guess is it's in secret. I don't think we know who's at the table. But one of the things that has to happen in these times of change is we need to get rid of these Neanderthal rules that puts us as faculty on one side of the institution and puts the student athletes who sit in our classes on the other side of the institution. I have vivid memories of trying to collect data on 2 or 3 different campuses where I worked and was told that you can't have access to that data, even though you know that they had it. You can't have these students over for dinner. You can't buy them tickets for the local movie house. All these kinds of rules that say, we don't want you near our athletes. When in fact, I could do all those things with any other student in my class, but I can't do that with the student athlete. That's one of those, or those types of rules that need to be dismissed and done away with.
Agreed.
It used to be a situation where you could give an athlete a piece of bread, but if you put peanut butter on the piece of bread, it was against the rules because it became a meal because peanut butter was so high in protein. That is just so silly. It's just silly.
So,
Oh.
no, go ahead, Eddie.
I'm just going to briefly say that, but that, you know, that control, that's the key word that we've been talking about throughout this entire conversation, right? There's this institutional control, the institution first, institutional profit first, which is what I talked about in the Washington Post piece, is that there's just this long history of higher education history to where the institution has always prioritized its well-being over the well-being of student athletes, but especially Black student athletes, right? And this is how higher education, no different than the federal government, no different than a lot of Craig Stephen Wilder talks about this in his book. No different than how the church functions is one of those three big arms of society that has really maintained the social hierarchy. And what we see right now, colleges are, their bank account is built on this idea of tradition. Right? There's homecoming. There's this idea of what we do on our campus. Clemson with this idea of family, right? Regardless of what era you come through, you know Clemson is about family. This institutional tradition is so important, but the institutional traditions are perverse. They are taking advantage of us in so many different ways. And what we see there is that control issue, even though it looks different by century after century, what you still see are the same ramifications unfolding day after day. So this idea of control is so fascinating to think about. It's so historic in that what we're dealing with today, that's what we're trying to dismantle, when we talk about trying to imagine what higher education looks like post-pandemic, whenever, if that may be, that's one of the first things that comes to mind is that how do we completely have this upending, if you will, of how higher education functions?
Can I piggyback off of that comment, Robin?
Yeah, I've got several questions
Okay,
that are coming in, but go ahead.
I was just
A couple minutes.
okay, all right. So I was just going to say that because when I read Dr. Cole's article in the Post, one of the things that stood out was he talked about how academic leaders use language and it becomes profitable, right? And we see that happening not just with the traditions, but the language. And so when we're sitting here thinking about the student athlete voice and these demands that the Pac-12, University of Texas, University of Wisconsin, all these student athletes are putting out, this is coming after statements of solidarity. This is coming after universities shifting funds and making priorities and demands of their faculty and their staff to make movement towards demonstrating support for Black students. And it's also coming after the NCAA now has this designation. They're asking for these chief diversity officers. So institutions and athletic departments who have never had a diversity officer like an Albert Bemper or University of Wisconsin or Brown, they've never had that be a part of it. They're now being asked to have this designation that is to entail some action that shifts. So that is good intentions. But one of the criticisms that I've seen is, you know, if we do it, are you doing it because you're standing in solidarity? Are you doing it because you actually want to make change? Or are you only doing it because it's kind of like the new buzzword right now? We have to demonstrate that there is a pseudo emphasis on this. And there was a panel a couple weeks ago, and Dr. Renee Miles Payne was talking about she has the experience to do it, she has the aptitude to do it, and she's been doing it for years. It's a part of her job title. And so we have to think about, you know, we have to take the control back from profit and make the control about the output, right? And so when we start holding ourselves accountable in athletic departments and partnering with faculty and partnering with the experts on campus who know how to do this work, I really think that switching that control that Dr. Cole just pointed out becomes a lot more feasible, right? Because we actually are thinking about outcomes and not just being responsive to what the system is. And we have an opportunity to really live out all of these amazing, well-crafted Black Lives Matter statements of solidarity from coaches and athletic departments that already went out. We get to hold them accountable for that.
So one of the questions that someone asked, I think that folks have kind of touched on it, but they're asking, how should athletic directors or coaches invest more time in the professional development of student athletes? And then there was something that also got at like academic advisors, like how can academic advisors help and support more loudly?
Well, some of that, the latter part of the question depends on the structure of how the athletic department is embedded inside the larger institution. I've worked in institutions where all students are assigned an academic advisor. But when it came to the student athletes, basically, and this is swimmers, cross-country runners, etc. Basically, what they wanted from you was your signature as their academic advisor, so that then they can go back to the athletic department, and whoever those people are, quote, advisors, they set up the schedule that the students would take in that particular semester or year. And I've seen that at large publics, and I've seen it at small liberal arts. So you're the academic advisor. You have students from everywhere, including athletics, but the athletic department simply wants your signature, and then they set the schedule for the students. And then, you know, in sports that suck up all the student athletes' time, they don't want course after 3 o'clock. They don't want lab courses in there. The student might be telling you, I'm interested in the student area of study because you have other demands sport-wise. It's a problem, and that's a very good question. Problem.
When I think about who has like the most access to student athletes, I do think about our academic advisors. And they are really our grassroots source of support for our student athletes. And so we have to make sure that they feel empowered and that they have access to resources and are supported to actually support the student athletes. One of the things that Dr. Smith was bringing up in regards to like the limiting of time, and you can only go to class between athletics. Plain and simple. I think we have to, that's some of that control piece. Again, we have to take back the narrative and say, maybe you can only have practice when the student is not in class. Now that does become difficult with, well, we have 100 football players or we have 50 track and field athletes. What does that look like? But it does offer an opportunity for the athletic directors and those in the senior athletic director seats, again, to negotiate what does that look like moving forward so that we can prioritize the student athlete experience and not just the athletic experience, so that we can really make sure that we are moving. And I saw one of the questions was talking about supporting professional development. Well, it's easy. You have to create time for that. You have to make sure that that opportunity is available to them. But if we have, 20 hours of practice, 15 hours of film, if their entire lives are usurped, they're not going to have an opportunity to develop holistically so that they can be ready to graduate and be prosperous citizens and employees. So first we have to start at the beginning with saying, okay, coaches, what is it that you actually need to compete well, not what you want and think you need. And so that's a post-COVID conversation. It's for us to renegotiate, the NCAA says this number of hours, but is that what's really needed? And having the athlete's voice and to say, well, here's my time and when I can. And I know with some of the Olympic sports, it's a little bit more flexible than others, but sometimes it isn't. But I just want to bring that up, that the athlete might have to say what they can and cannot do because of their goals and their priorities, and we build athletics around them.
So I had a question that came in from an athletic director that said, you mentioned athletic directors are typically absent from these big conversations, the big table conversations, and that in particular, this athletic director says that they feel powerless to make change because they understand most of that change begins with the leadership. Is there anything an athletic administrator can do in sort of helping to change that role? I will add that when I was a faculty athletic rep at unnamed institution, the athletic director and I were glued at the hip. I mean, there were conversations all the time. And the conversations that I had with him were typically in preparation to meet with a chancellor. And the chancellor's discourse with us, and it's hard for me to try and give that institution any kind of dap, but I'm going to. There was a close conversation with the three of us all of the time, but that started with, there was a former student affairs professional that was in a position and left and went to another school. And I remember him telling me, it will behoove you and it will help and support students if you are always in conversation with that athletic director, that he or she has to become your best friend. And you have to be at the table to have conversations with that chancellor and be prepared to say things that that athletic director cannot say, because you have not only DRA in front of your name, and he did too, DR, but you also have tenured, and that helps with that conversation.
But I also think faculty athletic representatives, they function differently and have, different levels of impact and interest depending on the institution. So I think a great example is, you're informed and you were interested and you were committed, but are all FARs invited to the table to be there, to have that discussion? Do they feel like they are given equal access and valued? And I've talked with a couple who don't feel valued, they don't feel invited, and then they aren't gonna go beyond their own comfort zone to do so. So I think, in a post-COVID, I really love that post-COVID because it's so aspirational at this point. But in this post-COVID society, can we reimagine what that role looks like in a way that we need that academic voice. We need that tenured voice at the table to challenge and not be so quick to be removed, right? I think that that's a power that from a faculty perspective can be flexed a lot more, and being thoughtful about who fills that role. But when I also think about the way in which athletic administrators, they probably feel power. If you are in an unhealthy, toxic work environment, or your leader is so focused on their vision that they aren't open to shifting their vision, it becomes really difficult to speak up. And so that means that your culture and your climate is not suitable for change. And that's the focus that has to happen, is how do you draw attention to an unhealthy or silencing work environment to where you can feel more comfortable to speak up. And while that's a conversation, again, with the athletic director, those in HR or DEI person, whatever, some of the DEI work that needs to be done doesn't have to happen with student athletes. It needs to be done with the administrators, especially when we're at institutions that have Black and brown bodies on them and no Black or brown who are in power at the table. So that's just a whole nother conversation. But that's what I think about when I think about shifting that culture and really empowering people to speak up so that they have leadership. There has to be an environment where they feel included and that their voice is valued.
And allow me to add something.
Well, for me, hello?
You got it, go ahead.
But I just want to say, for both sets of comments, Dr. Hughes and Dr. Ferguson, for me, hearing this, it's sad that athletic directors who are in charge of the department can't speak up. For me, it just shows.
Oh, darn. Earl, I think we lost you. I think Eddie wanted to add something, and then we have just a few more minutes, but Eddie, go ahead, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
Okay, while we wait on Dr. Smith to reconnect, let me just say this one thing to that athletic director or any other senior athletic administrators who feel like they don't have much say in the overall university leadership. One thing that I talk about historically throughout my book that I think is important to this moment is that athletic directors,
Functional nature.
if your situation doesn't allow you to chime in with the university chancellor, that level conversation, you have to be willing to perhaps sacrifice your own reputation or your own public getting credit for something in exchange for advancing the students' cause, helping the student athletes. And we see this throughout history, particularly with Black college presidents during the Jim Crow era, in the sense that oftentimes they could not say certain things, right? They're these white state legislators, the white governors, these people who control the purse strings, if you will, to Black colleges. But oftentimes they had these conversations behind closed doors with the people who could sway conversation. Historian Vanessa Sitter Walker, her book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, talks about this. I talk about this in the first chapter of my book, The Campus Color Line. And so you see these opportunities where college presidents oftentimes throughout history would never go down as the people who were vocal leaders in the Black freedom movement, but they actually had to sacrifice their personal reputation to at least have these behind closed doors conversations with the people who could say things. We see this throughout the Deep South, where presidents certainly couldn't say things publicly, but oftentimes they would invite somebody else in from out of state who could come in and say the things that they've been waiting years to say, and they couldn't say that. So there's an opportunity right now, as things are so pertinent, so pressing right now for athletic directors, to say, okay, you might not have the chancellor's ear. Who else can you get close to, as Dr. Hughes alluded to, that you can say, all right, well, who can articulate the needs of student athletes on my behalf, right? You might not get credit for that as the leader of the athletic department, but we see that as a successful method in these particular moments where time is critical and you may not have the formal bureaucratic access to certain people, but there are always people who have an ear to the important person, if you will. So that's one of the things that outside of the formal things you can do, that's one of the informal behind closed doors conversations that we've seen successful throughout history that I think is going to be absolutely critical for athletic department directors right now to use.
I appreciate that. So we have like a minute left, and I wanted to talk a little bit, but I won't. They just sent me a note that said, please, for me to say, please stay tuned for part 2 of this conversation. So what I envision are a series of these conversations about athletics in general, but I think they have to happen very quickly now, and there has to be some intentionality. And tonight's going to be one of those nights that I can't sleep, because I know that there are a group of students in the Pac-12, as well as other conferences, whose necks are on the line. And so something has to be done. Somebody has to say something. And I think that this is a start. But as I look at the students who are being protected, who are also uniquely gifted through performance, the musicians, the dancers, the actors, all the thespians, all of those folks, they're not on campus. The only folks that are on campus that are performance driven and gifted are the student athletes. And we know what that's about. We know that it's all about revenue generation in 2 sports that are, and you said it very provocatively, I thought, in the Washington Post, and I was like, I can't believe they printed that. But it has to do with Black males being overrepresented in football and basketball and the revenue that they generate to those institutions. So the dancers and the thespians and the flutists, et cetera, you ain't bringing in the bucks. So they are at home and they're being protected, and they are included in all of those task force guidelines, but these folks are not. And none of us should be able to sleep at night. Somebody has to do something, and I cannot stand letter writing campaigns, but doggone it. That's a start, but I like calling folks up and just sitting down and having a conversation. But folks have to do something. It is just not cool. It sure looks, and I've tweeted this over and over and over again. And my daughter keeps saying, quit being shady and just send out a read. But it just sort of harkens on like a quasi or neo Tuskegee experiment. You know they're gonna get sick. Why is it okay for this particular group of kids or people, young folks, to have to work under these kind of conditions? And it is work. Please be clear about that. Let's quit calling it amateurism, or I'm never going to say that because it's not. So with that, everyone have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you guys, and I appreciate it. And
Thanks for
say
having me.
you guys, thank you all.
Absolutely.
Thank you.